What medieval brothels, whorehouses, were really like. Picture this. Southwark, London, 1161. The Bishop of Winchester just signed off on 18 official brothels along the Thames. Not hidden in back alleys, not whispered about in secret, official, licensed, taxed. The church literally owned them. Wait, what? Yeah, you read that right. The medieval Catholic Church was running brothels. And they weren't alone. City councils across Europe were licensing, regulating, and profiting from organized prostitution. We're talking municipal brothels with rule books, health inspections, and employee protections that would make modern HR departments jealous. This wasn't some dark secret. Medieval people didn't hide it or pretend it wasn't happening. They built these places right in town centers, gave them official names, and wrote the regulations down in public records that still exist today. But here's what gets interesting. Everything you think you know about medieval brothels is probably wrong. The dirty back alley stereotype, the exploitation and darkness, that's mostly a projection of Victorian attitudes onto medieval reality. The actual historical record tells a completely different story. One that's way more complicated, more organized, and honestly more humane than what came after. The official story. Let's start with the part that blows most people's minds. Medieval brothels were legal businesses, not tolerated, not ignored, legal. In 1347, the city of Florence opened Il Frascato, a municipally owned and operated brothel. The city council voted on it. They built the building with public funds. They hired managers and set prices. This wasn't some seedy operation. It was city infrastructure, like the grain warehouse or the public baths. And Florence wasn't unique. Munich opened official brothels in 1433, Nuremberg in 1396, Ulm, Strasbourg, Cologne, Vienna, Amsterdam. Every major city in Europe had them. We're not talking about a few outliers here. This was standard urban planning. The city of Dijon, France, kept detailed records of their municipal brothel from 1385 to 1447. We know what they charged, who worked there, what rules governed the place, and how much tax revenue it generated. These weren't criminals operating in shadows. They were paying taxes and filing paperwork. But here's where it gets really weird. The church was often the landlord. Those Southwark brothels in London, owned by the Bishop of Winchester. The workers were called Winchester geese because they technically fell under ecclesiastical jurisdiction. The bishop collected rent and protected them from secular law enforcement. When these women died, they were buried in a church-owned cemetery, specifically designated for them. The cognitive dissonance is real. How do you square that with everything we think we know about medieval Christianity? The answer is actually pretty straightforward once you understand medieval thinking. They saw prostitution as a necessary evil. Not good, but necessary, like sewers. You don't celebrate sewers, but you sure as hell want them properly managed. The theology behind it. Thomas Aquinas laid out the logic in the 13th century, and it's brutally pragmatic. And he argued that banning prostitution would lead to worse sins. Without a controlled outlet for male lust, you'd see more rape, more adultery, more seduction of virgins, more sodomy. His exact words, "Take away the sewer, and you will fill the palace with pollution." Charming guy. But this wasn't some fringe opinion. This was mainstream theological teaching. Augustine said the same thing 800 years earlier. So did Jerome. The church fathers weren't endorsing prostitution. They were advocating for harm reduction centuries before that term existed. And here's the kicker, they might have been right. Cities that tried to ban prostitution saw increases in sexual violence. When Avignon expelled all sex workers in 1441, rape cases spiked so dramatically they reversed the policy within 3 years. Same story in Strasbourg, Vienna, Whorehouses, and half a dozen other cities that experimented with prohibition. Medieval people noticed this pattern and adjusted accordingly, so they licensed brothels, regulated them, and contained them. Not because they thought sex work was good, but because the alternative was demonstrably worse. It's utilitarian ethics wrapped in theological language. But let's be clear about something. This wasn't some enlightened feminist stance. The goal wasn't to protect sex workers. The goal was to protect respectable women from the sexual aggression that medieval society assumed was just baked into men. The logic went, men are going to seek out sex. Better they do it with women who are already fallen than assault your daughter. It's protecting the social order, not the individual women involved. Still, that framework led to something unexpected. Protections inside the regulations. Medieval brothel regulations were shockingly detailed, and in many ways, surprisingly protective. Let's look at the rules from Toulouse, France, established in 1201. First rule: no woman could be forced to work in a brothel. Any woman could leave at any time. Brothel keepers who tried to keep women against their will faced heavy fines and potential banishment from the city. Second rule: no woman could be recruited before age 18. The penalty for violating this? Same as for rape. We're talking execution or castration depending on the jurisdiction. Third rule: women working in brothels had to be paid directly. Customers paid the woman, not the brothel keeper. The keeper got a cut for providing the room and facilities, but the majority went to the worker. In most cities, the split was 60-40 or 70-30 in favor of the woman. Fourth rule: no violence. Customers who assaulted sex workers faced the same penalties as if they'd assaulted any other citizen. In some cities, the penalties were actually harsher because the woman was considered to be under city protection. Fifth rule: medical examinations. In many cities, sex workers had to appear before city physicians for regular health checks. If they showed signs of disease, they were temporarily removed from work and given treatment. Compare that to 19th century London, where sick prostitutes were just left to suffer and spread disease. The city of Nuremberg went even further. Their 1396 regulations specified that brothel keepers had to provide clean linens, food, and clothing to workers. They had to maintain the building to city standards. They couldn't charge women excessive fees for room and board. If a woman got sick, the keeper had to pay for medical care. This wasn't optional. City inspectors checked these places regularly. We have records of brothel keepers being fined or losing their licenses for violations. Now, let's not romanticize this. These regulations existed primarily to prevent public health disasters and maintain social order. They weren't crafted with modern concepts of worker dignity in mind. But compare medieval Nuremberg to Victorian London or modern Nevada, and suddenly those medieval rules look pretty progressive. Who actually worked there? Here's where it gets complicated. Medieval sex workers weren't a monolithic group. You had women who chose this work because it paid better than their alternatives. You had women who were pressured into it by poverty or family. You had women who were literally sold by desperate parents. You had women fleeing worse situations. And you had women who saw it as temporary. The idea that every woman in a medieval brothel was trafficked or enslaved is wrong. So is the idea that they were all there by free choice. Like most things in history, the reality was messy. We have records from Florence showing that many sex workers came from rural areas seeking economic opportunity. The brothel wages were significantly higher than what a servant or textile worker could earn. A woman working in Il Frascato could make in 1 month what a maid made in 6 months. But here's the thing. Once you entered that world, leaving it was complicated. A medieval society had this concept of dishonor. Certain professions marked you as dishonorable: executioners, gravediggers, tanners, and prostitutes. Once you carried that mark, you couldn't just wash it off. No respectable man would marry you. No guild would accept you. No convent would take you unless you had serious money for a dowry. Some cities created exit ramps. In 1470, Vienna established the House of Converted Women, specifically for former sex workers who wanted to leave the profession. They got job training, a small stipend, and help finding marriage partners. Similar institutions existed in Cologne, Paris, and Rome. But for every success story, there were probably 10 women who tried to leave and found all doors closed. And then there's the darker side nobody likes to talk about. Debt bondage was real. A brothel keeper might advance money to a new worker for clothes, cosmetics, or medical care, then charge interest that kept her perpetually in debt. Technically, she could leave any time, but she'd still owe the money. And good luck paying that off working as a servant at 1/6 the wages. Medieval courts heard cases of women suing brothel keepers over fraudulent debts. Sometimes the women won, but the fact that these cases exist tells you the practice was common enough to need litigation. There were also foreign women. In Mediterranean cities, you find sex workers from Greece, Syria, North Africa, and Eastern Europe. How many of them came willingly versus how many were trafficked is impossible to say from the historical record. The documents just record them as foreign women, without elaborating on how they got there. The client experience. Let's talk about what actually happened inside these places because it wasn't what you're picturing. Medieval brothels were social spaces, not just transactional sex venues. In German-speaking cities, they were called Frauenhaus, which literally means women's house. They functioned kind of like taverns that also offered sexual services. You could go there just to drink and socialize. Many men did exactly that. The typical setup: a main hall with tables, benches, and a fireplace. The brothel keeper provided wine, beer, and sometimes food. Meals were extra. Women would sit with customers, talk, drink, and if both parties agreed, they'd go upstairs to a private room. The prices were regulated. In 15th century Dijon, the standard rate was 1 groat, which was about a day's wages for an unskilled laborer. That got you the room and one encounter. If you wanted the woman to stay the entire night, it cost extra. If you wanted specific services, those were negotiated separately. Compare that to modern prices, and it's actually pretty reasonable. A medieval sex worker could see 3 to 4 clients in an evening and earn more than a craftsman made in a week. But here's what's really interesting. These weren't anonymous transactions. Regular customers had favorite women they'd see repeatedly. They'd bring gifts. They'd help with expenses if she got sick. Some men left money to specific sex workers in their wills. We have records of this. There are even records of marriage. Not common, but it happened. A man would pay off a woman's debts to the brothel keeper, marry her, and rehabilitate her honor through the marriage. In some cities, there were charitable foundations specifically set up to provide dowries for former sex workers so they could marry. The social aspect mattered. These places provided companionship, conversation, and human connection in addition to sex. For traveling merchants, soldiers, and apprentices living away from home, the brothel might be the only place offering female company and something resembling domestic comfort. One German chronicler described a brothel as a home away from home for young men of the city. That's telling. The dark side. Okay, time to acknowledge the parts that weren't okay by any standard. Disease was rampant. Syphilis didn't exist in Europe until the 1490s, but gonorrhea was everywhere. Medieval medicine had no effective treatment. Those health inspections I mentioned, they could catch obvious symptoms, but nothing else. Women worked while infected. Men caught diseases and spread them. The mortality rate among sex workers was high, not just from disease, but from violence, pregnancy complications, and the general hazards of medieval life compounded by a high-risk profession. Speaking of pregnancy, contraception was primitive and unreliable. Women used sponges soaked in vinegar, pessaries made from wool and herbs, or just hoped withdrawal worked. It usually didn't. Pregnancy meant lost income and potentially death from childbirth complications. Infanticide was an open secret. Babies born to sex workers rarely survived. Some were given to foundling hospitals, which had mortality rates above 80%. Others simply disappeared. Well, medieval records don't provide details because nobody wanted details. Then there's age. Despite regulations saying no one under 18, enforcement was spotty. Girls as young as 14 or 15 worked in some brothels. In port cities with transient populations, it was probably younger. The records just don't say, which tells you medieval authorities either didn't know or didn't care to document it. Violence from clients happened despite legal protections. A sex worker could theoretically sue an abusive customer, but that required witnesses, money for a lawyer, and a court that took her seriously. Not all did. Brothel keepers could be exploitative bastards. Yes, there were regulations. Yes, there were inspections. But corruption existed. A keeper with connections could bribe inspectors, forge accounts, and run a much more abusive operation than the law allowed. And here's the thing that really bothers me about the historical record. Women's own voices are almost completely absent. Everything we know about medieval brothels comes from city regulations, court records, and male chroniclers. The women who actually lived this life left almost no written testimony. A few letters exist, a few court testimonies, but their perspective on their own experience, mostly lost. We can read what city councils thought about brothels. We can read what priests thought. We can read what customers thought. But what the women thought? That's mostly silence. The business model. Let's talk economics, because medieval brothels were businesses first and foremost. The typical ownership structure, a wealthy individual, often a city councilman or church official, owned the building. They leased it to a brothel keeper, usually a woman, who managed day-to-day operations. The keeper paid rent to the owner, taxes to the city, and took a percentage of the workers' earnings. In Dijon, the city owned the brothel building directly. They appointed a keeper who functioned as a city employee. The keeper got a salary plus a small cut of earnings. All profits beyond operating costs went into the city treasury. That arrangement was unusual, though. Most brothels were privately owned with heavy city regulation. The overhead was significant. You had to maintain the building, provide furniture and linens, stock wine and beer, pay for heating fuel, and cover medical care for workers. In some cities, you had to employ guards to prevent unauthorized entry. You needed a cook, servers, and cleaning staff. Profit margins weren't as huge as you might think. A well-run brothel in a major city might generate 100 to 200 florins per year for the owner after expenses. That's good money. Roughly equivalent to what a prosperous merchant made, but it wasn't making anyone obscenely wealthy. The real money was in licensing and taxes. Cities charged annual license fees that could run 50 to 100 florins just for the right to operate. They taxed earnings at 10 to 20%. They required brothel keepers to contribute to city projects. When Munich needed money to repair the city walls, they levied a special tax on the Frauenhaus. This is why cities defended these institutions so fiercely. They were revenue generators. Think about it. You have a business that requires no city investment, generates steady tax income. It helps prevent crimes that would be expensive to prosecute, and can be blamed for moral decay whenever you need a scapegoat. From a cynical governance perspective, it's perfect. Geographic variations. Not all European cities handled this the same way. Italian cities were the most pragmatic. Florence, Venice, Rome, Naples. They all had municipal brothels operated as city services. The Italian attitude was essentially, men need this, we'll provide it, moving on. German-speaking cities took regulation to an extreme. They created elaborate rule books specifying everything from what sex workers could wear, specific colored cloaks so they'd be identifiable in public, to what hours the brothel could operate, closed on Sunday and holy days, to which streets they could walk on. French cities fell somewhere in between. They licensed brothels, but left more management to private keepers. The regulations existed, but enforcement was looser. England was weird. Officially, prostitution was illegal. Unofficially, the Bishop of Winchester ran those Southwark brothels, and everyone pretended not to notice. English law had this concept of stews, which were technically bathhouses, but everyone knew what they really were. Spain had religious overtones. Brothels existed, but there was more emphasis on conversion and rehabilitation. The Crown funded institutions to help sex workers leave the profession and enter convents. Whether that was actually better or just a different form of social control is debatable. Eastern European cities had less documentation. We know brothels existed in Prague, Krakow, and other major trading centers, but the records are sparse. What survives suggests they followed Germanic patterns of heavy regulation. Port cities were the Wild West. In places like Marseille, Genoa, or Amsterdam, you had much higher populations of foreign sex workers, less stable enforcement, and more organized crime involvement. The official brothel might follow all regulations, but there were also unofficial operations in dockside taverns that did whatever they wanted. The decline. So what happened? Why did this system that lasted for 300 years suddenly collapse? Short answer: syphilis and the Protestant Reformation. Syphilis arrived in Europe around 1495. Within a decade, it was everywhere. And unlike gonorrhea, which was unpleasant but usually not fatal, syphilis killed people in horrifying ways. It also couldn't be hidden. The skin lesions in later stages were visible to everyone. Suddenly, those health inspections weren't catching anything. The disease was spreading despite regulations. People panicked. Cities started closing brothels in the early 1500s. Not all at once, but in waves. Nuremberg closed theirs in 1516, Strasbourg in 1519. Florence tried to close Il Frascato multiple times between 1511 and 1534 before it finally stuck. But syphilis alone didn't kill the system. The Protestant Reformation delivered the final blow. Martin Luther and the Protestant reformers took a much harder line on sexual morality than medieval Catholicism had. That pragmatic theology about necessary evils? Gone. Protestantism demanded moral purity, not utilitarian harm reduction. Even in Catholic regions, the Counter-Reformation pushed the Church towards stricter moral enforcement. The Council of Trent in the 1560s officially condemned municipal brothels. The Jesuit order made shutting them down a priority. By 1600, legal brothels had vanished from most European cities. And here's the ironic part. Prostitution didn't disappear. It just went underground. Street prostitution increased. Exploitation increased. Disease spread faster because there were no health inspections. Violence against sex workers increased because they had no legal protections. Everything that medieval regulations had tried to prevent came roaring back. The 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries were objectively worse for sex workers than the 15th century had been. Victorian London was a nightmare compared to medieval Nuremberg. That's not opinion. That's what the historical record shows. We criminalized prostitution, then spent 400 years dealing with the consequences of that decision. What this tells us. Here's what really gets me about this story. Medieval people, who we consider backwards and superstitious, created a system that acknowledged reality and tried to minimize harm. They didn't moralize themselves into absurdity. They looked at a messy problem and implemented imperfect but functional solutions. Then, we got more civilized and made everything worse. The Victorian era criminalized sex work, provided zero protections for sex workers, and created the exact hellscape that medieval regulations had prevented. We congratulated ourselves for our moral superiority, while women suffered in ways their medieval predecessors hadn't. Even today, most modern jurisdictions have worse protections for sex workers than 15th century Dijon did. Think about that. A French city in 1420 had mandatory health checks, anti-trafficking laws, assault protections, and debt bondage regulations. Compare that to the current legal situation in most of the world. We've spent 500 years pretending that criminalizing something makes it disappear, when every shred of evidence shows it just makes it more dangerous. Now look, I'm not saying medieval brothels were some feminist utopia. They absolutely weren't. The regulations existed to serve social order, not individual dignity. Women's choices were constrained by limited alternatives. The whole system was built on inequality. But within that framework, medieval cities created something that worked better than what came after. And maybe, just maybe, we could learn something from that. Conclusion. Medieval brothels were legal, regulated, and shockingly organized. Cities ran them as municipal services. The church owned the buildings. Workers had rights that wouldn't exist again for 500 years. And when we dismantled that system in the name of morality, we made everything worse. That's the story nobody tells you. We love our modern narrative of constant moral progress. But sometimes progress is circular. Sometimes the people we call primitive were actually handling messy reality better than we do. Medieval people weren't enlightened about sex work. They were pragmatic. They saw a problem that wouldn't go away, acknowledged it existed, and regulated it. They chose harm reduction over moral posturing. Then we chose moral posturing and called it progress. The question we should be asking isn't, how could medieval people allow this? The question should be, why did we tear down a system that was working and replace it with something demonstrably worse? I don't have a clean answer to that. History rarely provides clean answers. But I do know this. The next time someone tells you how backwards and barbaric medieval people were, you can remind them that 15th century sex workers had better legal protections than most modern ones do. That's not an argument for returning to medieval social structures. It's an argument for humility about our own moral progress. Maybe we don't have everything figured out. Maybe people 600 years ago understood some things better than we do, and maybe we should stop being so damn smug about our modernity. If you found this dive into forgotten history eye-opening, hit the like button and subscribe to Medieval Over Modern for more stories about what we lost when we stopped looking backward. Drop a comment and let me know what surprised you most about medieval brothels, or if you see any parallels to modern policy debates. Share this with anyone interested in history, social policy, or just understanding how the past was way more complicated than we've been told.